So first of all, I just want to say hi and thanks for joining our chat about consonants. My name's Sarah and I work here at the MMR research team as part of the qualitative team. Over the next about 45 minutes I'm going to be chatting to Ian Horritt, who is the head of qualitative research here at MMR, about consonants and why we believe it's so important. We've got quite a few people dialing in today to listen to this talk, so feel free to send us any questions as we chat through, or you can use our Twitter feed hashtag MMR webinar to send us any questions that you want us to answer. And we'll try and go through those questions as we're talking through our discussion. But if we run out of time at the end, then we'll probably reply directly in an email to you with the answers to those queries. So firstly, Ian, it would be great if you could take us through exactly what we mean by the term consonant.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So consonance is a fairly sort of simple idea, but also a really important one in the kind of work that we do. In a nutshell, really, consonance is about making sure that all the different elements of an offer sort of line up correctly, that they say the same thing in the same sort of way, and that none of them particularly jar, so that they all work together. And hopefully, in doing that, we ensure that the message then is put forward very strongly, very clearly, and very sort of precisely, if you like. You can imagine in some areas, consonance is quite obvious. It's quite obvious and easy to judge. You know, you can see quite easily sometimes if a pack, you know, lines up with some point of sale which is associated with a particular product or something. Ideally, they should, so that one can move from one to the other, so that you can locate the pack on the shelf on the basis of something you see in advertising or point of sale or something. So in some senses, consonance can be quite an easy concept to grasp, but it can also be more difficult. So those examples I gave were where the sense of sight is particularly important. You can see whether things are aligned or not, and objectively sort of discuss those fairly easily because it involves a fairly objective removed sense. When it's things to do with odour, to do with taste, it can get more complicated. It's exactly the same principles, no difference in the principles at all or how important they are, but the way that you go about working out whether consonance is there or isn't there are quite different and are trickier.
Okay, so the opposite of consonance, dissonance. What is that? Is that a bad thing then? Is consonance the only way forward, or can dissonance be good also?
So yes, consonance is what we aim for. Ideally, that's what we really want to see. So all the different elements saying the same thing at the same time in the same way. As you can imagine, that's not usually the case. There's normally something which is out of step. So if we start with that, we describe that as dissonance. So if we start thinking about that for a second, one might assume dissonance is bad, consonance is good. And in a sense, yes, if you're trying to communicate one thing very clearly and very simply. But actually, the reality is most offerings are trying to communicate more than one thing, and those things may not be as coherent as you might imagine. So there may be a need to communicate two things which aren't contradictory but aren't necessarily exactly the same. So a product may need to be sort of traditional yet exciting, for example. I mean, you know, those things aren't necessarily fully aligned, and it may be that one aspect of the offer, so the product, does more work on seeming exciting, whereas the pack does more effort on seeming you know, traditional or something. So that's a kind of fixed state form of dissonance, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But then most of the work we do, most of the time that clients come to us, as I'm sure it's the same for every research agency, is when they're trying to move, in a sense, from being one thing to another. So to use that same example again, if they're perceived at the moment, say they're perfect consonant between their product, their pack, their communications, all the rest of it, but they're perceived to be quite traditional, and what they want to be seen as is more exciting, there's a need to move all of those things on whatever way you measure it from one place to another. In an ideal world, you would move all those things at perfectly the same direction, perfectly the same time, and perfectly the same pace. But we don't really live in a perfect world, and you know, it's much easier to achieve movement in some things like comms or like pack than it is necessarily in some other areas like product. So what tends to happen is one thing will move more quickly than the others. And that can achieve dissonance. You can achieve dissonance in that way as well. But we'd see that as positive dissonance if the overall move is in the right direction. What we try and do and what we recommend that our clients do is measure that as precisely as possible. so that they know, and nothing gets too far out of step, so they know what's out of step, if you like, and make sure it's out of step in the right direction, and make sure it doesn't go too far, that it starts jarring, because that's the negative impact, not always negative actually, but primarily the negative impact of dissonance is that things just don't seem right, or it doesn't seem to match, or on some level there seems to be a disconnect. Quite often that's at an emotional level actually, rather than a sort of obvious rational level, but that can be a bit of an issue.
Okay, and who should be thinking about consonance and dissonance? Who's it important to?
We work primarily in consumer goods sectors, so we specialise we specialise in food and drink, personal care and household care, and the examples that I've just given are basically from those fields. So things are quite neatly broken down there for us into pack, into product, etc., and it's quite easy to talk about. But there's no difference between a consumer goods sector and another sector. If I take the example of financial services, for example, you have a brand. A brand's actually very important in financial services work and financial services offerings. And then you have a series of products and actually an experience when you go into branch or log onto a website. And it's really important that all those things line up, because people, especially given the problems in the world recently to do with people's trust in financial institutions and all the rest of it, what you don't need to be doing is putting doubt in people's minds, is doing things that don't seem like they're well thought through, or that they line up precisely. So perhaps you see an advert for a bank which makes it appear very friendly and very personal on the TV, and then if you go into a branch and you receive certain service which isn't friendly and isn't personal, or there's something about the decor of the branch, for example, which doesn't fit with that, then you've got dissonance there, and that can be a real issue. So that's financial services can be really important there. And then I used to do a lot of work in the technology sector, and these things are just as important there. So there are lots of different touch points when it comes to a device. The menu, the form factor of the device itself, the pack that it comes in, very important, and all that kind of stuff aside from the communications. If you take a product like, a really successful product, a really successful product like Apple's iPhone or iPod even before that, what they did there was they created a whole experience which was extremely consonant. So from the packaging, through the product, through the menus and the interface, both the web interface, the app store and all the rest of it, just felt like one thing. It really felt like it was going in the right direction. I think that's something, Android struggles with a bit due to the very nature of it. They're very different beasts. Apple retain quite a lot of control over all of their touch points, store as well.
Okay, so you've just talked us through their consonants at a more general level. So let's move on to how consonants can work in action. Let's start right at the beginning of the MPD cycle and talk about strategy. We at MMR, we've helped various clients encapsulate consonants from the very beginning of projects. So how do we ensure this happens right from the start?
As a qualitative researcher, one of the things that we know is very important is bringing people together. And what we try and do as much as we can is establish a place, a time, an environment, an atmosphere where different members of the project team, so for example people from R&D and marketing and sales and whatever, can come together and can establish as much common ground as possible. That will pay dividends down the line. So it may be that R&D are there, but actually they're not involved in developing the product just yet. But when they are, if they've shared this experience from the start, then later on, that'll make things a lot easier for them. So on a basic level, we think that the most important thing, at the start of the project is, as far as possible, getting people together in the same room. But getting people together in the same room is one thing. Doing that in the sort of light, if you like, of consumer research is another, and that's really what we see as the most important. So bringing together disparate members of a project team with consumers who are deconstructing the product and the category and their experience of it and the emotional connections that they make with that category is absolutely valuable. If I can give you an example, we work in an increasingly global world. Lots of product teams are quite global these days. That's absolutely fine. If, for example, we had a problem, we were making a product and we decided it wasn't fresh enough. People were giving us that feedback and making some more fresh. Well, that's fine. If I say it needs to be more fresh, I have one understanding of that, and that might be fairly similar, not the same by any means, but fairly similar to yours, Sarah, because we have fairly similar backgrounds. But then, if the product is being made in a tropical country or a very cold country, their understanding of the word fresh is likely to be very different, if not often fairly opposite to mine. So we may be able to use the same word if we have some kind of common language and think we're working in the same direction, but the actual specifics and the detail of what we're working and doing can actually be quite contradictory. So by establishing common ground and often a common language at the very start, as early as possible in the product development life cycle, we hopefully remove some of those issues. So if the consumer from, say if the product development is taking place in Brazil, and the marketing people are in England, say you do the research and people say fresh, then it's not to say that the other interpretations of fresh are wrong. What we do is we narrow it down. So well, when they say fresh, they're actually meaning X, Y, Z in terms of product attributes, and that gives a consistency for people to work towards, which is very, very useful.
Okay, you've just started talking a little bit about it then, but what happens when client presents us with various barriers with regards to trying to do this, trying to get consonants at the start of the project? How do we go about dealing with that?
Well, that is a good question. It's not too long ago, a few months ago, we went to a client meeting and we proposed this type of approach to kick off a project about a brand which interestingly has a very different presence in different parts of the world. It's a traditional British brand, but it's consumed in other parts of the world and perceived in a very different way. And because of that, and because of the volumes that are shifted in different parts of the country, the stuff is manufactured in India, yet a large part of the project team sit in the UK and others sit in the US. So we proposed this kind of methodology where people all get together at the start of the project, and the first question from the client was, how's this going to work when they're all over the world, and they're not going to fly in for this? Can we do it on video conference? Can we do it on teleconference? The answer really was, well, yes, you can, but it isn't going to carry the same weight. It isn't going to work as effectively, because with the best will in the world and the best call management in the world, the people who aren't in the room are going to feel slightly out of it. They're not going to be able to shape the conversation, because allowing the client's direct interaction with consumers is a really empowering part of the kind of research we're talking about here. To hear it from the horse's mouth, if you like, rather than second or third hand, can be really, really important. So in that instance, in many instances, we face these kind of logistical problems of, I don't think we're going to get the whole team to fly over and this, that, and the other. And the answer is, if you're not going to invest in aligning in this sort of way, then it isn't going to work as well. It's always inevitably going to be a slightly watered down version of what we're talking about. So I'd say probably with flight bans and all the rest of it, flight restrictions, that's probably the single biggest obstacle we face in doing this kind of work. Apart from people sparing the time, is actually getting them in the right place at the right time. I will say though that once they've experienced this kind of research and the difference it can make to the product development life cycle, normally they're not so reluctant in the future to invest in it, because it becomes an important project milestone.
Okay, so my main question for this section then is, why are we looking at a picture of Dora the Explorer? just to show the importance of people coming together from different parts of the world. Okay, brilliant.
Monkey.
So moving on from starting a project and ensuring consonants within that project, I want to move on to thinking about consonants at a concept level. What do we do? What are the ways that we ensure that the concept is aligned with the other parts of the offering, whether that be the brand or the client offering itself?
Yeah, it's very interesting area, this. I mean, qualitatively, people have done work on concepts, since the beginning of qualitative research. It's an obvious way to use, group discussion time is to pick apart and bounce ideas around about a concept and hopefully move forward and all the rest of it. I think over time, that often is turned into a bit of a sort of, what do you think of this one? Great. What do you think of that one? Chopping through them, evaluating the concepts really quickly, and then saying to people which one best fits the brand, would you say? At the end of looking at 8 concepts. And whilst, that's fine, there's some value, definitely some value in doing that. You get an awful lot of really rich feedback on the concept, which can help the clients amend and move them forward in doing that kind of thing. What it doesn't do is give you the sort of pure read of a concept which is really most useful for us in this context. So what we have moved towards is a methodology where we give consumers time and the space, both are very important in this kind of work, to evaluate concepts on their own. So what we often do is we'll pin up into the wall concepts around a room in sort of exhibition style, like a sort of art gallery, if you like, and we'll give consumers plenty of time to have a look around, spend more time than if they want to on one concept and less time on another if they think it's simple. We provide them with the materials to note down what they think of them, the good and the bad points, anything they don't understand. And rather than do that bit in a group, we encourage them to do it on their own. And it may take, depends on the number of concepts, the complexity of the concepts, and also how different they are to things that consumers are familiar with already. But that may take 45 minutes, around that sort of time of people digesting these things on their own. And then we do the group work at the end of that. So when people have had a chance to immerse themselves really in the concepts as deeply as possible, in as pure a sense as possible.
I think it's quite interesting as well, before the actual research happens, we work quite closely, don't we, and with the clients to make sure that the concepts are to a similar standard, so that we make sure that we evaluate each concept on a level playing field. We do, and this is a slightly tricky area in some ways, because I think things have changed probably in the time that I've been working in market research on this basis. When I started out, clients wouldn't really have expected us to get involved in the concepts and how they're written, and they wouldn't really have valued our opinion particularly. But I think now there's an acceptance that as market researchers we see a lot of consumer feedback on concepts, and actually we can be quite helpful in terms of those concepts. So we know what the kind of things, there are golden rules, like the insight part of a concept is always a tricky bit for consumers to get them to understand, and can often colour people's perceptions of the concept. So if clients, which they often do, have slightly gone over the top with the insight, then maybe we can say, well, that's the kind of thing that we know jars with people, or it's something a bit patronising, so why don't we tone that bit down and make it more aligned with this one or that one. So yeah, we can spend a bit of time on the concept before we do this kind of work. We really have to balance that quite carefully against the need to not be writing the concepts ourselves, because if we do that and then we test them and then we report back, the objectivity of the research practitioner is somewhat questionable in that arrangement. So whilst we can advise on what works and what doesn't, we always steer clear of actually writing the things for them, because that gets tricky. Yeah. Thank you. We've just had our first question in. If this concept is a new concept, new to market, so something new that there isn't a competitor out there, what are we trying to make it consonant to? What are we trying to make it fit to?
More often than not, that's the brand. So it's a very good question. So if, for example, a major food manufacturer, to take it back to a food example, had decided that they wanted to make a ready meal, and they'd never made one before, and they might have a number of different brands within their portfolio that they could use, and they had a clear idea for the kind of ready meal they wanted to do. Maybe so it was going to be something like a whole foods, it's quite healthy ready meal or something like that.
Yeah.
They might think, okay, I wonder, we could do this under one of 4 brands, and I think in the sort of old-fashioned way, it would be, okay, let's stick it under the strongest brand, give it the biggest distribution and see how it goes. Well, actually, that's probably not the right way to think about it. If they have a number of brands, the product, as it's imagined, is likely to be more consonant with one of those brands than another. So to put it simply, it's then about working out, is it best under which brand, and how much do we need to tailor how do we tailor that product to make it fit most clearly to that brand.
Okay, so we kind of understand what each brand's communicating, and then what this idea is communicating, and then link that up. Is that what you're trying to say? Yeah,
that's exactly what I'm trying to say, yes. I guess to take the question a stage further, the product is genuine, and this isn't often the case, but is genuinely sort of earth-shatteringly innovative, and is a sort of category-breaking product in its own right. Then the question becomes slightly different. Then what you often find, and this is something that happens in technology more than anything, because the categories are quite fluid and quite, more quickly moving in a technology sector. Often, in some cases, because of, for whatever reason, patent reasons or whatever, the product itself can be fairly fixed. And what it can then be a case of is, okay, how do we, or can we tailor our brand to better fit the product, because the product itself kind of stands in its own right.
Okay, so we've just talked about consonants with regards to at the concept level. I want to move on now to talking about the product itself and the product formulation. How can you ensure consonants within a product formulation? Because surely that's pretty tricky, right?
Yes, it is tricky. There's no doubt about it. In some ways, this is the part of the equation where things do get more difficult, because everyone experiences the consumption of a product in a slightly different way, in a very sort of subjective way. We're lucky enough to have a strong background in sensory science, and we actually have sensory science centres around the globe, which are very busy and very successful, and that's given us a particular way of accessing this kind of information. So one of the most important things we realise is that products do communicate emotional values very, very. I mean, obviously they communicate functional values as well. So something, a product to take a drink, for example, might be highly carbonated, or it might be very fizzy or not very fizzy. So on a functional level, it might be hot, it might be cold. It's doing those things, and that's fine. Then there's a grey area of what's functional and what's emotional. Sometimes those things overlap quite a lot. But then we get into a realm of pure emotional values, which all products communicate through their consumption. So it may be that the particular colour of a product makes it seem, fun, versus makes it seem artificial, versus makes it seem natural, versus makes it seem different. Every attribute of every product communicates an awful lot. The trick is understanding what it's communicating, and then understanding how you need to change it to make it communicate something else. So what we do is we spend a lot of time making sure that the people that we invite along to this kind of consumer research are able, A, to pick apart the precise differences at quite a fine level between different product attributes, so different types of sweetness, different types of sourness, different colours, sizes and shapes and all the rest of it. So that on the one hand they have the ability to do that, which not everybody has, so I don't have, for example, so they're strong from a sensory point of view. But then, second and most important, equally important thing is to make sure that they have the articulacy, the ability to put that into words, so that they can express those differences as clearly as possible, and that they to some extent understand the fact that product attributes aren't just descriptive, that they can be more emotive as well. And what we find is we're talking here about a screening process, actually a face-to-face screening process, which puts consumers through their paces in sensory terms, not to the same extent you would have to be put through your paces to be on the panel, but to a similar degree. And also with the articulacy as well, we're basically removing poor performers in sensory terms and people whose articulacy isn't very good, so that when we come to the actual research itself, we don't have atypical consumers, we don't have people that are misrepresenting the category. But what we've done is we've raised the bar in terms of their ability and willingness, actually, to talk about these things. So to go, quite often in a group setting, people try and find a level which is appropriate for everybody, and that's human nature. Sometimes people buck that trend, and you're a moderator, you know that as well as I do. But generally, people will find a level they're comfortable with. What we do is we screen people in advance to remove the poorest performers, so that that level that people are comfortable with is higher and more productive than it otherwise would be. It's as simple as that, really, and it preserves the energy levels, because we're talking here about quite a detailed way of doing research, quite a product-focused kind of research, so quite important that energy levels are as high as possible.
I have to say, after moderating some of the consumer workshops that we're going to talk about in a minute, the screening session really helps to make our jobs a lot easier as well, because even though they're longer sessions, I find they're a lot easier to moderate and control, because the conversation does flow a lot easier. People are very helpful, they're very articulate, and they can tell me things that I definitely can't pick up myself. So that's always, it's a very interesting group to moderate. So shall we move on to talking about the consumer workshops themselves then? So consumers go through this sensory screening process, and we pick the most, the articulate and the most, the ones that can detect the most sensory differences. And then they come into these consumer workshops. Do you want to talk us through a little bit about what those workshops are and what they entail?
Yeah, definitely. So the key thing about these workshops and about the way that we conduct this kind of research is really that we try and empower the consumers as much as possible. I mean, they've been through, by the time they get to this stage, they've been through this sort of slightly unusual screening process to test the things that we were just talking about. And the first thing that we do is basically tell them that they've passed that and tell them that they, that their ability is higher, their ability is very good in this area, and that we're going to use that ability in what we do next. And then what we typically do is we talk about the concept, we talk about the category, we understand and establish common ground in terms of the emotional values that are important in that category for that product, for that concept. And what we will have done in advance is work with the client to select a number of stimulus products or prototypes which exhibit different product attribute characteristics from the category of good spread, and we'll have them evaluate those products in a variety of different ways. It might be looking at them, it might be tasting some of them, smelling them, that type of thing, in a series of sort of fairly controlled, almost experimental type tests, to then really break it down and understand which specific product attributes are linking to which emotional values. It's all about that linkage, because once you understand that, you can turn them up and down. So if you understand that a particular, the inclusion of a particular herb in a cracker is making it seem, healthy, and you want it to seem more healthy, and you know that it's the size of the pieces of that herb that are doing that, then you make them bigger, you make it seem more healthy. If that's the way you want to push your brand, that's what you want to be doing. It's quite specific on that level. You can get down to some fairly granular and very granular findings, which are very useful for R&D teams.
I think another interesting point to mention with regards to these consumer workshops as well is that they're actually moderated by two people. So you have a qualitative moderator and also a sensory scientist moderator. So do you want to talk through why we do that?
Yeah, definitely. So, Sarah, you and I are both qualitative moderators, and it's our job most of the time, and in this kind of session to do all the moderatory type things. So to make sure that everybody feels comfortable, to make sure that the group dynamic establishes itself, and that we work consumers hard enough, but not too hard, to keep energy levels high, and also to do the sort of logistical stuff like keep to time and all that kind of stuff. So to keep things flowing and to keep things working well. One of the ways, as well as I do, that we do that is that when people agree, we move on, so that they don't feel like they're kind of wasting their time. They feel like there's progression, they feel like there's movement, they feel like the group is going somewhere. That's great. What we don't necessarily know as qualitative moderators is that how much precision is going to be needed in terms of that sensory language for the R&D teams to be able to actually use. Sensory scientists at MMR do have that knowledge, they do have that background, and the food technology background is very good, and they'll have worked with the R&D teams in the build-up to the project, to the workshop, to understand exactly what attributes can be changed and how they can be changed, so they know where they need that. So as we're moving things on and keeping the group flowing and keeping energy levels high, in a good cop sense, as bad cops, it's sometimes their job to pull things back and say, okay, hang on, you were talking here about the taste or the smell of coffee, for example, and then to understand whether that's coffee beans or it's roast coffee, is it bitter, what's the particular smell? Because at the back of their mind, they're thinking actually this could be X coming through as the smell of coffee, or it could be Y coming through as the smell of coffee. What we need to do is we need to work through this and understand exactly what it is that we're talking about, so that when we play it back to the R&D guys at the end, they know what to do to change it.
Okay. Before we move on from talking about consonants within products and within the development of products, I have got a question that just come in that's been passed to me. When you say that all products communicate different emotional values, do different products have stronger emotional connections than others? So do you find some products easier to investigate in order to draw those emotional connections out, than other products.
Yes, definitely, and not just products, but not just different products in different categories have different kind of more obvious, I suppose, kind of emotional connections and emotional links, but also occasion and specific context can be really important here. So the time that we consume, sometimes we may do something, you know, almost without thinking about it, and it just becomes, you know, part of the way that we're just kind of going about our lives. Other times it's much more considered and can be much more of an emotional connection with something. So I think there's an awful lot of variety. I mean, there are some obvious categories we work in where, and I'm thinking here about something like cosmetics, where so female cosmetics, where the emotional values are really extremely important, and the differentiators between one product and another. Yes, there's often a claimed functional difference between two products that are essentially similar, but actually the connection that consumers make is almost entirely emotional in those kind of categories. And if you contrast that with some of the other, you know, I've mentioned financial services before, you know, things are a lot lower on the radar. But actually, the key thing really is that there are fewer emotional values up for grabs in something like financial services. So something like trust is important, and insurance and all that kind of thing. There isn't that much at play. When things reflect more closely the brand values of the consumer themselves, then there's more at play. And, you know, cosmetics is more close to oneself often than something like financial services.
I suppose we want to emphasise the point as well that every product has emotional values. It's just sometimes consumers seem more aware of them and they find it easier to talk about them, such as I know we did a female group with chocolate. So you can imagine how much vocab we were getting off the back of that and how they could talk about that versus other products that we do, which are a little bit like snack bars and things like that. Sometimes it can be harder to drill down to those emotional values, but they are still there. You just have to work a little bit harder in order to get to them. We have got one other question that's just come in. How important is the link with sensory when trying to achieve consonance?
Well, vital. I think sensory is very important in a particular way in this equation. Really, it's a bridge between what consumers say and what R&D need to do. So we work with a lot of clients who know that and have known for a number of years that their product is seen as X and it actually needs to be more Y. And they've been trying to achieve that all over the place. You know, they've tried everything and it just doesn't seem to work. Their measures aren't shifting, it's not happening for them. They've tried reformulating, they've tried this, they've tried that, and they just can't understand why the measures aren't shifting, why they're not moving in the direction that they want to towards the Y. And then quite often, what we do is we work with them to understand what they have tried to change and actually the kind of things that the parameters that they can work within. And what we do is we ensure that we have their language in our minds when we've not in the consumer sense, because quite often R&D language and consumer language are a long way apart. But it's very important that when we do our analysis, we're able to play it back so that we establish what the link is. So that if they do want to be more Y and they want consumers to say that they're more Y, they know what they need to do, how they need to, you know, turn their dials or whatever they need to do to change the settings on their machines to make the product come out more like that. So in answer to the question, the sensory aspect is about the precision that you get out of the end. So there's no point giving them an output that says you need to be more exciting. They need to know how that's achieved and what it is they need to do tomorrow in the lab to make a product that's more exciting. Sensory gives them that precision.
I think that's also interesting because we let the R&D team actually sit in these workshops as well, so they're not behind the mirror. So they're actually part of the conversation, so they can throw in questions. Consumers throw questions back to them, and it is a very, very open, honest conversation. I think they actually enjoy that element of things as well. Yeah,
I think so. With the best briefing in the world and the best immersion in the world, we can't get as close to the understanding of how to make a particular product as someone who's been making it for 30 years. So we don't see the point of them sitting behind the screen thinking, I wish they were asking this. We think, get them in the room, help them, enable them, put them in a position where they can ask the questions that they need the answers to, so that they go away from the session thinking, goodness me, I've got more powerful directional stuff here than I've had for a long time.
Okay, so just moving on from the concept and product. So after the research for the concept and product has been done, we found out what we need to from that. Thinking about the communication of it, obviously there are different approaches available to ensure the correct tone is being set. So how do we help the client select the right approach?
Communication is a very, big area in market research. Lots of theories about how to best communicate various different things. I guess what we take here is a very grounded view of communicating about a product. I mean, you could sit down and come up with some amazing ways to talk about any product, and they could be really motivating for consumers and really get people wanting to try it. But then if you promise them X, or promise them, something, and then they experience the product and it doesn't deliver, there's dissonance there. They were, we call it disappointment or whatever, or, failing to live up to expectations. But basically there's disappointment, there's a problem. And that can discourage repeat purchase in the future and have a, fairly significant impact on people's perception of a brand as well. If you're saying one thing and delivering another, that's a problem. So what we try and do, or what we do, is work with clients to really immerse consumers. Again, to be totally honest with you, comes a lot down to the screening process and to making sure that we have people who are very articulate and very, very able to, work with words and work with language. And what we do is we put them in a situation normally where they're using different products from a category and sort of talking about it, if you like, sort of freestyling about the products and about their experience of it. And what we then do is we ladder from keywords that they use to try and get to really motivating, really exciting language, but really importantly, language which is based on a particular experience, a particular connection, be it functional, be it emotional, with that product that doesn't exist with other products. So if I give you an example of cornflakes, if you wanted to really, talk about your brand of cornflakes in a particular way, you might have people in a group all eating the same brand of cornflakes at the same time, talking about the experience, talking about what they get from it, and the moderator's job there is to ladder up to get to really motivating language. Then you move on to another brand of cornflakes, and by the time you've done that, you'll establish what's different about what you can actually say about cornflakes, which is not only motivating, not only inspiring, but also firmly linked to a USP, to an actual difference, functional difference between one product and the others.
Okay, so we've just talked about consonants in terms of a concept, product, and comms, and they can all be researched in this way with regards to consonants. But how do we know it holds true when the product is actually consumed after the product's out there?
I was rushing ahead, but yes. To be totally honest here, technology has been a very big friend to the market researcher in this area. Basically, context, as I mentioned before, is absolutely crucial. So we do a lot of our research in a sort of, if anyone who's familiar with market research will know what I mean when I say a sort of focus group environment. So, a fairly drably decorated room in a sort of viewing studio, that type of place. But when people actually use products and consume products, they're not normally in those kind of environments. They're normally either, in their own home or at work or wherever, and they're often in a very different sort of mindset. So what we do is we use technology as much as possible to allow and to encourage people to report back on the differences they experience when actually using a product for real. So to give you, we used to use kind of web-based online communities to do this type of thing, and actually more recently we've developed our own app, which we've done specifically to help with this kind of product. And rather than be to interviewer-led or focused on probing or asking specific questions, what we really allow consumers to do is to live with products, to use them as they will, to consume them when they will, however they will, and then give them a platform through which they can report back on how the experience was for them on an emotional level. So you can then work out if it's a product that can be consumed in a number of different ways. And actually, one of those different ways, methods of consumption, is very different to the others for whatever reason, and that can be a real springboard for future MPD. So sometimes that can suggest to you that there's room here for another type of product, or there's another, or another brand or another offering. Sometimes it's not that clear cut, and actually you just realise that there is a fair amount of consistency across different ways of consuming something. But it's really important to understand that kind of thing, and really important not to assume too much about the way that people are going to use or consume a product over time.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about consonants of developing a product right from the early stage NPD stages and then right the way through. But how long will this product be assessed by consumers? How long are they looking at it and actually judging it? Surely they make an assumption and that assumption stays throughout the product life?
Yeah, an interesting question. Well, I mean, in many ways, the key thing is, and I think this is where social media is playing a very useful role in research these days. I think the best managed brands understand that they need to stay on top of, very much on top of these different kind of consumption occasions and their implications for their brands. So they may use, social media, either interaction or monitoring, to establish, exactly when a new consumption occasion is thrown up which seems to be different to others, or whatever. And if that is a springboard, then they're right there, right at the start. And actually, some brands try and shape, but through the same sort of means actually, but try and shape, or through above the line communication, will try and shape consumption occasions, because they may know that actually, eating, I don't know about breakfast, I'm quite hungry, but eating, their product may fit better with their brand if you eat it at work rather than at home, so they may encourage you to do that sort of through communications, because they know there'll be more connection if you're in an office than if you work in an office than if you are at home. That type of thing, a bad example, but shaping the way that people consume things, managing that a bit more as well.
Okay, so we've come to the end of our discussion. I have got one extra question here that I think should be mentioned on the webinar. Just got a question coming in. So if 90% of MPD fails, how does Consonance help with this?
That's an interesting question. I think it's a statistic that's often bandied around, isn't it? And I think the failure of MPD, I always think that's a bit of a harsh term, because whilst the product may be delisted from a supermarket, that doesn't necessarily mean it's totally failed. It can have achieved something along the way as well. So if, for example, a brand is perceived as being too much fun, I think it would be too much fun, but if you were perceived as being too much fun, and they tried to get a product listed, it wasn't as much fun, and if people noticed it and people saw it but actually didn't buy it, and it got delisted, that doesn't necessarily mean it's failed. It may have actually helped them shift their brand. It may have achieved something, and it may have displaced actually a competitor for a short period of time or something, or gone up against something in an interesting way. So I really think that statistic is overplayed, actually. I think probably it's actually better saying 90% of products are delisted by supermarkets, within a couple of years of them being launched. But I think, so the answer really is, I think that an understanding of consonants and the different touch points really is key to understanding whether that is a failure or not, and what you can take out of it. So is there, was there a positive brand shift or anything like that was achieved even before the product was delisted?
Oh, that's what you talked about earlier with that positive dissonance then.
Exactly. So for example, a failure, to use that term, maybe that the product itself seemed was too exciting relative to the brand. Is that a failure? Well, yes, in a sense it is, but actually it may be, like I was saying before, springboard, and may suggest that you need a new brand. So let's rebrand it and try it again, and maybe it will succeed. To use that the sort of black and white measure the next time. But I think we've got to be careful of reading too much into consonance and dissonance. Tells you that success and failure are not necessarily always to do with how many units you're shipping or where you all the rest of it. Obviously, that's a key component of everything that business is trying to achieve, but it's not the be all and end all necessarily. There are other measures which are just as important.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you, Ian, and thanks for everyone who listened into this. It's proved to be quite a popular topic, so we've got a link available for anyone who wants to listen again or pass the conversation on, which will be emailed to everyone who joined, and also will be available on our website. We haven't managed to get through all of the questions that came in, so we're going to answer some of them directly by email. But if you want to get in touch with us with any more questions off the back of this, You can see both of our emails, Ian's and mine, on the screen right now. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with any further questions. Again, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.